Episode 64, Peloponnesian Congress and the Spartan Ultimatum, 431 BCE. This episode on the Everything History podcast, I break down the Allied Congress that decides on the matter of war, and break down the subtle but fascinating negotiations between Sparta and Athens in the last throes of diplomacy.
I discharged my last duty as king and emperor.
This is Everything History.
Everything you hold worthwhile is at stake.
We meant more to kids than Jesus did, or religion at that time.
I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth.
Shortly after the Spartans concluded their debate, they began preparations for war against Athens and her empire. First, the Spartans sent a messenger to Apollo's temple at Delphi to inquire from the oracle, and thereby Apollo, whether they ought to commence war. Apollo replied through his oracle that if the Spartans used all their might and all their resources, victory would be theirs. Immediately after, the Spartans assembled their many allies to vote on the prospect of declaring war. The year was still 432 BCE, and matters were moving very quickly now in Greece, where the situation was dire. Potidæa was still under siege in northern Greece, but the Spartans were now awoken. And when awoken, the Spartan Lacedaemonians were a fast, decisive war machine. At the Allied Congress in Sparta, the Corinthians delivered the final speech, with the intent of convincing all the Peloponnesians to vote for a declaration of war. I'll abbreviate it now. The Corinthian speaker rose in the Congress and said, quote, "Fellow allies, there is no occasion now for us to make any complaints about the Spartans. They have already voted for war themselves, and they have summoned us here to do the same thing. Indeed, this is what a leader should do. Now, all those of us who have already had dealings with the Athenians do not need to be told that we have to be on our guard against them. But those who live inland or off the main trade routes ought to recognize the fact that, if they fail to support the maritime powers, they will find it much more difficult to secure an outlet for their exports and to receive in return the goods which are imported to them by sea. If the maritime powers of the Peloponnese are sacrificed, it will not be long before the danger spreads farther, until they too are threatened, and that thus this discussion affects them just as much as it affects us. Therefore, they should not shrink from the prospect of choosing war instead of peace. Now, on this present occasion, it is because we are the victims of aggression and because we have adequate reasons that we are going to war. There are many reasons why victory should be ours. First, we are superior in numbers and in military experience. Secondly, one and all together, we obey the orders that we receive. As for sea power, in which they are strong, we shall build ours up both from the existing resources of our alliance and also from the funds of Olympia and in Delphi. The power of Athens rests on mercenaries rather than on their own citizens. We, on the other hand, are less likely to be affected in this way, since our strength is in men rather than in money. There are also other ways open to us for carrying on the war. We can foster revolts among their allies, and this is the best means of depriving them of the revenues on which their strength depends. Or we can build fortified positions in their country, and there will be other ways and means which no one can foresee at present, since war is certainly not one of those things which followed a fixed pattern. And here is another point to consider. We have Athens to fight, and Athens is so much stronger than any single state in our alliance that she is capable of standing up to all of us together. So unless we go to war with her, not only in full force, but also with every city and every nationality inspired by the same purpose, she will find us divided and will easily subdue us. And let us be sure that defeat, terrible as it may sound, could mean nothing else but total slavery. To the Peloponnese, the very mention of such a possibility is shameful. As for the future, you must look to that by safeguarding what you have now and by being willing to face sacrifices. It is in your blood to regard all kinds of excellence as the prizes of toil and sweat, and you ought not to change that way of looking at things if you have at the moment some advantages in wealth and in power, or it would be wrong to lose because of plenty what was gained because of abstinence. Instead, we must go forward into this war, in the knowledge that we have many reasons for feeling confident. We are acting on the authority of the God, who has himself promised to support us, and all the rest of Hellas will be with us in this struggle, either through fear of slavery or through hope of liberation. From every point of view, therefore, you have good reason to go to war, and this is what we recommend as being in the interest of all of us, remembering that identity of interest, both among cities and among individuals, is the surest of all guarantees. Let there be no delay, therefore, in coming to the help of the people of Potidæa. Fellow allies, you must recognize that the crucial moment has come, that the advice we give to you is the best possible advice, and you must vote for war. Do not be afraid of the terrors of the moment, but set your minds instead on the enduring peace that will follow war. As for that dictator city which has been established in Hellas, let us make up our minds that it is there to dominate all alike, and is planning to subdue what has not already been subdued. Let us then go forward against it and destroy Athens. Let us be able to live our own lives in the future without fear, and let us liberate the Hellenes who are now enslaved." End quote. The Corinthian speech lasts in Thucydides' text from Book 1, chapters 120 to 125. Thereafter the Spartans closed the floor and began the voting procedure, each city-state of the Peloponnese casting a vote, and the majority voted for war, and with that, the Peloponnesian League was now unified against Athens and her mighty empire. The Spartans in the inland pole, that is city-states, began preparations for configuring the land armies, and the Corinthians and other maritime pole began to amass a fleet. The Peloponnesian War was on, and the Spartans would attack in less than a year, the year 431 BCE to be exact. In the meantime, the Spartans sent an emissary to Athens and demanded that the Athenians should, quote, "drive out the curse of the goddess," end quote. A peculiar and very famous demand, and later a notable turn of phrase. The Spartans were referring to ancient Athens' accursed past, and it is a tale that is crucial to understand now, and one that I have yet to tell. The curse of the goddess in Athens goes back to when Cylon attempted to make himself tyrant of Athens around 630 BCE. Cylon had attempted to do so because he had received an extremely confusing instruction from the oracle at Delphi, telling him to seize the Athenian Acropolis during the great festival of Zeus. When he did so, perhaps at the wrong time, who the hell knows really, Cylon and his followers were quickly besieged by the Athenian people and cut off as they held the Acropolis. Eventually, a great deal of the citizenry surrounding the Acropolis got bored, and the 9 archons of Athens were left to deal with the situation, with a couple dozen citizens under their command. Soon after, Cylon and his brother escaped, but the rest did not. So as the archons busted into the Acropolis, the surviving rebels of Cylon's force made themselves suppliants to Athena at her altar. And they did this because it is gravely sacrilegious to kill a suppliant at a divine altar, so the Athenians, led by the archons, persuaded them to leave, offering food and a promise that they would not hurt them. But they did hurt them. In fact, they killed them, and the goddess remembered, and thus she cursed the Athenians involved in this sacrilegious affair. Soon after, the same Athenians also killed others who clung to the altars of the dread goddesses. For these reasons, the guilty Athenians who committed these grave deeds were cursed, and their children after them were cursed as well. A very famous family was among them, the Alcmeonidae. And these families were driven into exile over time, and the bones of their forefathers exhumed and cast out of the city of Athens. But one family came back, the wealthy and powerful Alcmeonidae, among whom was Megacles, the great Cleisthenes, and during the time of our current history, the great Pericles. So when, in early 431 BC, the Spartans demanded the expulsion of the curse of the goddess, they were tactfully and blatantly referring to Pericles, the leader of Athenian democracy. Now, the Athenians ignored the demand, of course, but Sparta had gotten its message across in a unique way. They forewarned Athens' destruction, and directed their threat not at the Athenian citizens, but at Pericles himself. The Athenians tried to dig up similar, less ominous curses about Sparta, and made similar demands of Sparta. Thereafter, Sparta made their demands more clear of Athens. The Spartans demanded that the Athenians abandon their siege of Potidæa, give Aegina her independence, and allow the Megarians to enter the ports of Athens and all her affiliated imperial allies or tribute states. The Athenians refused all 3 requests without debate. The Spartans expected nothing less from the Athenians, and forthwith sent their famous ultimatum. The messengers of this ultimatum were Ramphius, Melesippus, and Agasander. They issued the ultimatum which read, quote, "Sparta wants peace. Peace is still possible if you will give the Hellenes their freedom." End quote. The Athenians then finally deliberated the matter. Our faithful Thucydides was there and witnessed the speeches. He recorded the speech of Pericles, who was by far and away the most powerful man in Athens, having led Athenian democracy, ironic that is, for over 20 years as of this speech. Concerning the Spartan ultimatum, in abbreviated fashion, Pericles gave the following oration. Quote, "Athenians, my views are the same as ever. I am against making any concessions to the Peloponnesians. On this occasion I must give you the exact same advice as I have given in the past, and I call upon those of you who are persuaded by my words to give your full support to these resolutions which we are making all together, and to abide by them even if in some respect or other we find ourselves in difficulty. It was evident before that Sparta was plotting against us, and now it is even more evident. It is laid down in the treaty the differences between us should be settled by arbitration, and that, pending arbitration, each side should keep what it has. The Spartans have never once asked for arbitration, nor have they accepted our offers to submit to it. They prefer to settle their complaints by war rather than by peaceful negotiations. And now they come here not even making protest, but trying to give us orders. They tell us to abandon the siege of Potidæa, to give Aegina her independence, and to revoke the Megarian decree. and finally they come to us with a proclamation that we must give the Hellenes their freedom. Let none of you think that we should be going to war for a trifle, if we refuse to revoke the Megarian decree. It is a point they make much of, and say that war need not take place if we revoke this decree. But if we do go to war, let there be no kind of suspicion in your hearts that the war was over a small matter. You must make up your minds what you are going to do, either to give way to them before being hurt by them, or, if we go to war, as I think we should do, to be determined that whether the reason put forward is big or small, we are not in any case going to climb down nor hold our possessions under a constant threat of interference. When one's equals, before resorting to arbitration, make claims on their neighbors and put those claims in the form of commands, it would still be slavish to give in to them, however big or however small such claims may be. Realize also that we are not the weaker party. The Peloponnesians cultivate their own land themselves. They have no financial resources either as individuals or as states. Then, too, they have no experience of fighting overseas, nor of any fighting that lasts a long time, since the wars they fight against each other are, because of their poverty, short affairs. Such people are incapable of often manning a fleet or often sending out an army, when that means absence from their own land, expense from their own funds, and apart from this, when we have control of the sea, and wars are paid for by the possession of reserves rather than by a sudden increase of taxation. In a single battle, the Peloponnesians and their allies could stand up to all the rest of Hellas, but they cannot fight a war against a power unlike themselves, so long as they have no central, deliberative authority to produce quick, decisive action, when they all have equal votes, though they all come from different nationalities, and every one of these is mainly concerned with its own interest. It never occurs to any of them that the apathy of one will damage the interest of all. Instead, each state thinks that the responsibility for its future belongs to someone else, and so, while everyone has the same idea privately, no one notices that from a general point of view, things are going downhill. But this is the main point. They will be handicapped by the lack of money, and delayed by the time they will have to take in procuring it. But in war, opportunity waits for no man. Then we have nothing to fear from their navy, nor need we be alarmed at the prospect of their building fortifications in Attica. So far as that goes, even in peacetime, it is not easy to build one city strong enough to be a check upon another. This would be a much harder thing to accomplish in enemy territory and faced with our own fortifications, which are just as strong as anything that they could build. While if they merely establish some minor outpost, they could certainly do some harm to part of our land by raiding and by receiving deserters. But this could by no means prevent us from retaliating by the use of our sea power and from sailing to their territory and building fortifications there, for we have acquired more experience of land fighting through our naval operations than they have of sea fighting through their operations on land. And as for seamanship, they will find that a difficult lesson to learn. You yourselves have been studying it ever since the end of the Persian Wars, and have still not entirely mastered the subject. How then can it be supposed that they could ever make such progress? They are farmers, not sailors, and in addition to that they will never get a chance of practicing, because we shall be blockading them with strong naval forces. Seamanship, just like anything else, is an art. It is not something that can be picked up and studied in one's spare time. Indeed, it allows one no spare time for anything else. Suppose they lay their hands on the money of Olympia, or Delphi, and try to attract foreign sailors in our navy by offering higher rates of pay. That would be a serious thing if we were still not able to match them by ourselves, and with our resident aliens serving on board our ships. As it is, we can always match them in this way. Then, too, how many of our foreign sailors would, for the sake of a few days' extra pay, fight on the other side at the risk not only of being defeated, but also of being outlawed from their own cities? I have given, I think, a fair enough account of the position of the Peloponnesians. As for our own position, it has none of the weaknesses which I have noticed in theirs, and it also has a strength entirely of its own. If they invade our country by land, we will invade theirs by sea, and it will turn out that the destruction of the part of the Peloponnese will be worse for them than the destruction of the whole of Attica would be for us, for they can get no more land without fighting for it, while we have plenty of land both in the islands and on the continent. Sea power is enormously important. Suppose we were an island, would we not be absolutely secure from attack? As it is, we must try to think of ourselves as islanders. We must abandon our land and our houses and safeguard the sea and the city. We must not, through anger at losing land and homes, join battle with the greatly superior forces of the Peloponnesians. What we should lament is not the loss of houses or of land, but the loss of men's lives. Men come first, the rest is the fruit of their labor. And if I thought I could persuade you to do it, I would urge you to go out and lay waste your property with your own hands and show the Peloponnesians that it is not for the sake of this that you are likely to give in to them. I could give you many other reasons why you should feel confident in ultimate victory. What I fear is not the enemy's strategy, but our own mistakes. However, I shall deal with this altogether on another occasion when words and action will go together. For the present, I recommend that we send back the Spartan ambassadors with the following answer: that we will give Megara access to our markets and our ports if at the same time Sparta exempts us and our allies from the operation of her orders for the expulsion of aliens. For in the treaty there is no clause forbidding either those orders of hers or our decree against Megara. And we will give independence to their allies if they had it at the time when the treaty between us and the Spartans was made. But the Spartans too must allow their own allies to be independent, but to also choose their own government rather than the kind of government that suits Spartan interests. Let us say too that we are willing, according to the terms of the treaty, to submit to arbitration, that we will not start the war, but that we shall resist those who do start it. This is the right reply to make, and it is the reply that this city of ours ought to make. We must realize that this war is being forced upon us, and the more readily we accept the challenge, the less eager to attack us our opponents will be. When our fathers stood against the Persians, they had no such resources as we have now. Indeed, they abandoned even what they had, and then it was by wisdom rather than by good fortune, by daring rather than material power, that they drove back the foreign invasion and made our city what it is today. We must live up to the standard they set. We must resist our enemies in any and every way, and try to leave to those who come after us an Athens that is greater than ever." End quote. Pericles' persuasive oration extends from Book 1, chapters 140 through 144. And after Pericles stepped down, the matter was basically decided because not many would dare to vote against the advice or motion of Pericles. That would mean political suicide, so to speak. Although that seems odd in a democracy, if you think on it, it makes perfect sense, sadly, that such a power dynamic would be working in a direct democracy. Thus, without further debate, the motion proposed by Pericles was agreed upon. And if you were listening attentively, Pericles, while mentioning peace strongly, was extremely belligerent. In fact, Pericles was doing quite a bit of warmongering while posturing as a man of peace. For example, every demand he said he would concede to, he promptly followed up with an outlandish demand of his own. And he also gravely undersold the capabilities of the Peloponnesians, but that can likely be chalked up to an excessive amount of zeal and pride as an Athenian citizen. And although the Spartans clearly were okay with war, they did not lie in their messages. Unlike Pericles, who spoke of arbitration but had no intent of serious negotiations, as his remarks about Megara and Aegina made excessively clear. The Spartans were fully aware of that, for they knew Pericles well enough to know that he would never concede to anything. Therefore, negotiations were a futile waste of valuable time. Now, to take a step back for a moment, let's invoke some thoughts on political science and ask the obvious question: was peace actually possible in this moment of political crisis? To consider peace as a possibility, both sides had to be willing, seriously willing, to consider peace, which means that each side needs to be willing to talk and be willing to take measures that are reasonable in order to avoid war. So, by those parameters, let's break down this crisis in 431 BCE with the Peloponnesian League on the one side and the Athenian Empire on the other. First things first, were both sides willing to talk? Yes, they in fact were. So we're good so far. But were both sides willing or able, which are two very different things, to de-escalate the crisis? No, they were not. Let's look at why. Were the Spartans willing to de-escalate? Well, they had already agreed to war with their allies, but this was not a declaration of war. That was a unified decision to launch war if terms of de-escalation were not met. Thucydides, and thereby I too, framed the story in a manner that shows their ultimatum as having come after their allied congress. That actually cannot be confirmed, although it is highly likely. So thus far, the Spartans are willing to de-escalate technically, but only if their terms are reasonable. So let's take a look at their terms again. The curse of the goddess stuff was a weird Hail Mary of a misdirection that our culture cannot understand, so let's throw that out of mind. So instead, let's look at their demands. They demanded that the siege of Potidæa be lifted. That is perfectly politically reasonable, no serious debate about that. Then they demanded the independence of Aegina. That is difficult. Technically a Peloponnesian island, but very near Athens, and had fought against Athens not long before. But Athens had not loosened her grip at all on Aegina, and that was actually rather strange. And you will recall Aegina having to send messengers to Sparta in secret. That tells us that Aegina is under foreign occupation, and we know that the Athenians had already cast down their walls. All that taken into account, this demand by the Spartans was actually reasonable, although Athens could reasonably ask for something in return, given Aegina's previous hostility and their proximity. Last, the Spartans demanded the revocation of the decree that debarred Megarians from all Athenian-controlled ports. This, too, is reasonable, and the Athenians could have also negotiated this point, too. Perhaps only opening a few ports, but a reasonable number. So the Spartan demands all indicate that the Spartans, although they set a very high bar, were willing to de-escalate the crisis to avoid widespread Hellenic war. Before I turn to the Athenians, understand that the crisis was settled before the Spartans issued the ultimatum. Their ultimatum demanding Hellenic freedom is vague and not a real ultimatum. But that is because the matter was actually already settled when the Athenians dismissed their demands. So understand this, the actual last opportunity for peace was when the Spartans issued their aforementioned demands. The later ultimatum reveals this information because the ultimatum was essentially a soft declaration of war, reminding the Athenians that they chose this path. So, was peace possible for the Athenian side of negotiations? This requires an explanation of something I mentioned earlier. I said that each side needed to be both willing and able to de-escalate. Keywords being willing and able. Both need to be true for the avoidance of war, but the most crucial is the able, because without the able, that is the ability, war is unavoidable. The negotiations prior to World War I are a great example of the concept, or concepts, I'm talking about. So were the Athenians able to de-escalate? Absolutely. They could submit to every demand without fear of immediate revolt or overturn of their empire or democracy. They could also easily negotiate more lenient terms involving money or trade restrictions to sell the concessions better to their people. But was Athens actually willing? Hell no. Pericles' speech is living proof of that. Throughout this crisis, and the crisis of Potidæa, and the crises over Corcyra and Epidamnus, Athens proved itself blind to political concerns and unwilling to actually participate in a serious negotiation because they felt so overwhelmingly confident. And that unwillingness is fascinating to see from a democratic society and makes it clear that they were more empire than democracy, I dare say. Therefore, war was avoidable, if only barely. And who knows for how long. But in this particular incident, war was settled upon because of the aggression of Athens, the obstinacy of Pericles, and the acceptance of the situation by the Lacedaemonians, although their acceptance is hardly to be considered a powerful reason, certainly not when compared to the two leading aforementioned reasons. Back to the history for a moment. After the Spartans received the reply of Pericles, they cut off all contact with Athens, and all of Hellas held their breath as they braced for the violence to come. That breath is let out in the next episode of the Everything History podcast. Stay tuned as the Peloponnesian War commences in, oddly enough, the city of Plataea. Remember that you can subscribe to the podcast on iTunes and YouTube, if you so choose, that is. And you can also contact me on the podcast's Facebook page or the email address everythinghistorypodcast@gmail.com.
Thank you very much.